Hi, it's Tom here from Running Physio. Today I wanted to talk to you about exercise selection for patellofemoral pain and to take you through some videos of exercise examples that I use in clinic and hopefully you can consider for people you see in clinic that come and see you with this type of knee pain. So we're going to have a look at some of those. We're going to include some good exercise options for the glutes, for improving movement control, and also how you can adapt some of your quads-based exercises, which frequently are a bit provocative for patellofemoral pain. I've also put a link to our free videos available over at Clinical Edge. Lots of great running injury videos there. Do check those out. They're free and they are available for you now. So let's start by thinking about how do we decide the exercises with an individual? Well, I think the first step needs to be identifying their individual needs. So the first step of this process is always a good assessment so you can choose the best exercises together. And assessing things like strength within the glutes and quads. I would also assess the hamstring strength and the calf strength as well, particularly in our runners, because these are key muscles that manage lots of load. So we start with a good assessment. I would also look at movement control as well. Now, personally, I like to look at the building blocks of movement control, things like single leg balance, single leg dip movements, and also any movement that a patient says is painful for them, such as going up and down stairs, because we can then try and make it specific to their symptoms and see if we can alter that movement pattern to reduce the stress on the knee. So first step, we've got to do our assessment. We've got to identify individual needs. We've also got to identify the time that someone has available, the resources they've got in terms of exercise equipment, etc. Because this is really important for helping ensure that these exercises are realistic for the individual. And we know then from the research there are several areas we may find with people with patellofemoral pain that we're commonly going to focus on. So this would include trying to build strength in the gluteal muscles, particularly glute med, which we know is important in knee pain as a big muscle in managing load in running. It takes about 4 times body weight in peak load. We know that the quads are very, very important too, and there's evidence to support strengthening up the glutes and quads in those with patellofemoral pain. Quads are a major stabilizer of the knee and again manage a lot of load in a lot of our functional tasks. We also know there's evidence too of altered movement control, which may put more stress on the knee for someone with patellofemoral pain. So in particular with that, we might see increased hip adduction and internal rotation during loading tasks, such as single leg squat or stair descent, and also running. We may see deeper ranges of knee flexion during those tasks. We see that in running, which is thought to increase the stress on the patellofemoral joint. So if we see those movements happening together, lots of knee flexion, lots of hip adduction and internal rotation is quite likely to be quite high load on the patellofemoral joint, which may be a piece of the puzzle. So we're reasoning through how we can change that. Now, we've moved away from the kind of VMO approach that was very popular for a while. So I don't believe we need to try and target VMO, and I don't think we can try and do that. It's more about exercising in a way that can strengthen up these muscles if they're weak and improve movement control, but without aggravating symptoms. And that's the balancing act that we have to strike. And that's where you want to select the exercises carefully with each individual, test them out to see how they are in clinic. And before we look at some of these exercise examples, a couple of other principles that I think are important. We want to load to achieve the goal that the patient wants from that particular exercise. So if it's to develop strength, we need to load enough to challenge them to increase their strength. So typically myself, I might load between 8 rep max and 12 rep max, something like that. So have the exercises so that they're really challenging within that rep range of about 8 to 12 reps, but try and tweak them so that they're not creating pain. Ideally, we want them pain-free, but if they are painful, the pain is mild and settles quickly. So we're going to load relatively heavy to try and build strength if we want to achieve that goal. If our aim is to improve movement control, to reduce the stress on sensitive tissue, it's more about movement quality, and I'm less inclined to add external load to that. I'm more going to focus on, can we help you move in a way that's more comfortable and puts less stress on this sensitive area. So those are a couple of principles to be aware of. We want to pick the right stage. If someone's highly irritable, it's more about calming things down than it is about loading them up. And then final principle before we dive into some of these exercise options is think about how the movement loads the knee. Now, there's recent research from Heart et al. That we talked about recently in one of our videos about what increases patellofemoral joint reaction force. And essentially, we think it's two key things. If we're loading in deeper knee flexion, or we're loading with more demand on the quads. So particularly in those early stages, if it's irritable, if we load outside of those deeper knee flexion ranges, or we reduce the demands on the quads, the exercises are going to be usually better tolerated. So those are some tweaks that you can make, particularly useful for things like your quads based exercises, where you may not want to go into deeper ranges of knee flexion for things like squats or leg press initially, because they're more likely to be provocative. So let's have a look at some exercise options then that I would use in clinic. Now here we're going to rely on the technology. I've made a few videos to show you, but as we know, sometimes the tech doesn't play along. If you're listening to this afterwards on the podcast, I'd recommend checking some of these out to see what we're talking about here. So first up, let's have a look at some of our control options. Now, personally, I often start with simple single leg balance, getting good control across the pelvis and through the femur too, and progress that with things like closing your eyes or going onto an unstable surface. That then prepares people for more dynamic tasks like simple single leg dip. Now, this is not a full squat. This is more of a single leg dip to replicate that kind of loading phase we see in running and build up the control there. Then a key point to add here is we want to bring in known aggravating factors. So perhaps a patient's moving like this when they come down the stairs, lots of hip adduction, putting more stress on the knee. They're telling us that that's painful, and we can focus a bit more on reducing that hip adduction during loading to hopefully reduce the stress on the knee and make it more comfortable. So we've got some options there in terms of control progression. Start with the simple static stuff, go on to more dynamic work, think about how it relates to painful activities that they've identified, and then potentially we can use this as a progression to prepare for impact and plyometrics. So perhaps going on to things like jump squats, bounding, perhaps progressing to hopping or multi-directional work eventually with these exercises. Now, if you're choosing to do that, obviously we've got to pick the appropriate stage. They want to be non-irritable. But we know there's some evidence, I believe from Nunes et al., showing power deficits in those with patellofemoral pain. So this type of progression, going through developing control, changing the provocative movements, and improving their tolerance allows us then to go into plyometric exercises, which can be useful to build power, which is often lost with patellofemoral pain, particularly around the hip. Now again, think about our reasoning process here. We know that there's likely to be more stress on the knee with deeper ranges of knee flexion or hip adduction. So we may be looking at that when we're bringing in plyometrics, particularly initially. So perhaps not going into very deep jump squats if that's particularly painful because we're loading into deeper knee flexion, or perhaps tweaking their landing strategy slightly if they move into an adduction and it's painful. Now, these are not because these movements are not correct. They're normal movement variations, but it's just because they may be placing some stress on the sensitive tissue that we may want to reduce to make things more comfortable. So it's not saying this is the right way to move, you were moving wrong. It's saying, can we make this a bit more comfortable for you? Now, you also might think about trying to do things like reduce the time in contact with the ground with your plyometrics. So imagine using a cue like run on hot coals, or try and speed up the activity so that the ground contact time is less. And that usually means less time to come into deeper knee flexion and deeper hip adduction. So there are ways that you can tweak these plyometric exercises to reduce the stress on the knee depending on the individual and their goals. And that's always what it's going to come back to. If you're working with someone who needs to load in deep knee flexion ranges, perhaps they're doing a sport that involves jumping, volleyball, basketball perhaps, we're not going to avoid that, but we need to think about the right stage to reintroduce that and ensure that it's well tolerated. So a few options there in terms of control progression. My reasoning process with my control exercises is certainly in early and the kind of middle level of rehab. I will put the control exercises at the start of a session. I will do the same with power and plyometric work, get people warmed up and include those things that involve more control early when people are fresh, because it's much harder to do it when you fatigue them. But it might be appropriate in late stage if someone's only getting pain in a fatigue state, maybe towards the end of a long run, to try and do some of this movement control work when they're fatigued. So perhaps after they've done their strength exercises to develop that control in a fatigue state. As ever, it's going to come down to a reasoning process and what's appropriate for your patient. So a few control options there, and I'll be honest, none of this is particularly snazzy, and nothing that you won't be aware of, but it's thinking about how we can integrate it within the patient's care. So next up, we've got some gluteal options. Now, I'm actually a fan of doing some simple sideline abduction work. So you see here with this, I've got a foam roller just in front of my shin here. And that's to stop me from flexing the hip, working as an external cue so that I'm actually abducting during the movement to work my glutes. So that can be a nice way. Now we've gone without a resistance early on here, just using the weight of the leg. But if that's not challenging and people can easily knock out sort of 12 plus reps without getting fatigue, we might add in a bit of resistance. So across the knee. Adding a bit of resistance here, and you've got to play around with the position so someone can feel like they're working the glutes on that side. You'll see too, I hold at the top of the movement here, so we've got some time under tension with that band to work the glutes against that resistance. Another nice option with this is to use a gym ball, and this can also help us ensure that we're putting the kind of emphasis on keeping the hip either neutral or slightly extended. So I'm going to squeeze the gym ball back against the wall and roll it up and down. We've got the weight of the gym ball at the end of a long lever there as a way of targeting glute med and also a little bit of glute max whilst we're extending the hip back to keep that ball in contact with the wall. So some simple sideline stuff can be quite nice to target glute med. And remember, this is normally a position with very, very low patellofemoral joint load. So it's usually well tolerated. And I might use this as part of an approach I call working down the leg. So maybe if someone's irritable, we start by strengthening them up around the hip with exercises that are unlikely to irritate because the load on the knee is very low. But we know there's evidence to support that gluteal strengthening can help pain. So perhaps that allows us then to settle symptoms to progress on down the leg and load at the knee, and maybe further down the line to progress further down the leg and load at the level of the foot and the calf if they're weak there. So quite a nice option, usually pretty well tolerated. We might then want to try and come into some weight-bearing gluteal options, such as wall press variations. Now, this one's a nice exercise that Michelle showed me on running repairs recently. So doing a hip hitch with a ball against the wall gives you a nice bit of feedback from the ball to try and use the glutes in their role to move the pelvis. So that's quite a nice exercise there for my right glute med in particular. Now there's also a variation of this which is more of a wall press with that outer leg. So you move the ball down the wall here. EMG studies show this is quite good for recruiting glute med on the weight bearing leg. Now again, if the leg's straight that I'm weight bearing on, very little load on the patellofemoral joint, so usually well tolerated, and I'm pushing that ball out into the wall with my left leg here. Could progress it with a slight knee bend, going to challenge the glutes on the right a little bit more to stabilize the femur, but a little bit more load on the patellofemoral joint on that right side. So a couple of isometric options there that are quite good to bring in for the glutes. Again, usually relatively well tolerated. And next up on our list, we have what I think is one of the humblest exercises, most underrated exercises, which is a step up. Now, step up's been shown in EMG studies to really effectively recruit glute max, and you can vary it to hit glute med as well. Now, what you'll notice me doing, if you look at my back leg that's on the floor, is I'm peeling the toes of that back leg up. So I'm not letting my back leg push up, and I'm using the leg on the step to do the work. And this is how you're going to work those glutes a bit harder. You're not letting that back leg push off. You're making the front leg do the work. Now then you can progress it by increasing hip flexion. So we're moving over a larger range for those hip muscles to manage, glute max and glute med. But the knee flexion range is staying relatively small, so the load at the knee stays relatively small. Now this again is probably going to be a progression on from your side lying work when people can tolerate load at the knee. And we can think about adding weight. Our load placement here, if we put the weight out in front, a long way out in front gives it a long lever arm to hit glute max. Again, still trying to make sure the leg on the step's doing the work and trying to come up as tall as you can. I think I could probably extend a bit more with that to get a bit more out of it for glute max. And then if you want to hit glute med more, you can bring the, if I'm wanting to left glute med, bring the weight away in my right hand so that again, we've got that long lever arm to work those left glutes and trying to make sure that leg on the step is doing most of the work. So quite a few nice options for a step up here, which you can progress further by increasing the height of the step or increasing the load that you're using. But again, you want to choose an appropriate stage for this for patients because we know some people with patellofemoral pain will find stair ascent uncomfortable. You may need to adapt it if they're adducting a lot of the hip, and that's uncomfortable too. So we've got quite a few exercise options available there that you can tweak for your patient. Few ideas for some sideline glutes work, wall press, some control work, progressing to plyometrics, step ups, all really nice options potentially to target the glutes and often well tolerated relatively early in the process. Now we want to be able to load at the knee as well. We know quads function is very important in patellofemoral pain, so we don't want to avoid that. We're going to be guided by the patient's symptoms. If they can tolerate that early on, great, but sometimes we need to work higher up first and reduce symptoms, calm things down with our load management, and then we can perhaps target the knee a little bit more and try and strengthen those quads. So the main ways we're going to be able to tweak these exercises to make it less irritating on the knee are, number one, how deep we go into knee flexion, and number two, how much load we're using that's going to challenge the quads. So if you want to introduce some quads work that's going to be better tolerated, shallow squats, maybe up to 70 to 80 degrees initially, again guided by symptoms, can be quite good. And if that's well tolerated, we might progress by increasing the load within that range. So we can increase the load to get the strength change we want and work in a range of movement that actually is similar to function. Particularly in our runners, they don't tend to need to be particularly strong right into deep knee flexion positions. And you can continue to progress by increasing the load with that squat to build up their strength, and then later on perhaps increase the range if that's part of their goal. Same thing would be true for a leg press, working in smaller ranges of knee flexion initially, progressing the load, and then considering progressing the range later on if you want to. You can actually include some seated knee extension work. Again, it's all going to be based on symptoms and their goals, but if we want to isolate the quads, doing some seated knee extension work can do that. Now, often this is provocative, so we might start two-leg work in the gym or very light loads potentially, and work through the range that feels most comfortable. Now, this can be a little bit different. Sometimes it's better tolerated between about 90 degrees of knee flexion and about 50 degrees of knee flexion. So like you have an arc of movement there, but see what the patient finds they can manage in terms of symptoms. Start at a low manageable level, and then you can progress the load up towards levels that will build strength. Now, as we said, we don't want to shy away from loading the knee. If we're preparing it for sport, we know patellofemoral joint load in running, for example, can be about 7.5 times body weight. We need to expose the knee to some load to get it used to it. We can't avoid load at all times, but we need to progress it gradually at the right stage and based on symptoms. And part of this might then include progressing to things like lunges, which we know also do have quite a high patellofemoral load, but at the right stage and based on that symptom response. So few options there to tweak with your squats, your leg press and things. Be guided by symptoms and restrict the range typically initially to allow yourself to load to get the strength back there. Now we might then, if we're progressing down the leg, we've strengthened up at the hip, we've strengthened up at the knee, we may then want to address the level of the foot. Now, I'm not saying you have to follow this order. You could do it in a completely different order if it's appropriate for the patient. You might even start at the foot if that was in particularly important. But we know that the calf manages very high peak loads during running. And so it's worth, I think, assessing it because it's another important muscle in us managing load. So we might then start to include some calf work within their rehab, especially if they're weak on that side. So it could be things like your simple straight leg calf raises. Very unlikely to irritate the knee because there's very little knee flexion. You might go into more of a bent knee calf raises, a progression, a little bit more load at the knee. Or you might come into something like a Soleus squat. Now this is a Soleus squat, back against the wall, knees slightly flexed and going up onto your toes and holding it isometrically. So you're going to get a bit of Soleus work, a little bit of quads work. You can then progress that onto single leg, which is obviously significantly more challenging. You really feel this one through the calf. If you want to hit the quads a bit more with this, you simply go deeper into range. So a little bit more knee flexion for this. You'll start to feel it hitting the quads more than the glutes. Again, of course, it's going to be a little bit more challenging for the patellofemoral joint to manage. But a nice option there if you want to try and get a little bit of quads, a little bit of glutes all thrown in together. Okay, so hopefully that's given you some exercise ideas. As ever with these topics that we talk through, it's so important that you pick the patient appropriately, pick the right stage, and test these out with them to see how they feel, see if they are well tolerated and they feel manageable to them. Sometimes we need to start at a lower level and progress before we can actually get them to the point where they're loading enough to build strength. But that's fine. It's better to do that than to overload very early in the process and really irritate symptoms. Now, exercise selection is an important part, I think, of management of patellofemoral pain and running injuries in general. But it's not the only part. We know load management is especially important in patellofemoral pain. So while we want to bring the rehab exercises in, we need to try and see if we can modify some of the other things that are loading and aggravating the knee to help it settle. We know education and understanding is also very, very important too. And there's evidence of central sensitization in patellofemoral pain. So let's not put all of our emphasis only on exercise selection. Let's think a bit more broadly here, help the person understand their symptoms and manage their activity level, and then have a selection typically of maybe 3, maximum of 4 exercises. You don't, I think, need more than that because you're going to overload people if you're throwing too much in. But done maybe as little as 2 or 3 times a week with the appropriate load can make quite a big difference. And then we can look to progress them over time by increasing the load or increasing the range or progressing them functionally back towards the activities that are valuable for them. Okay, I hope you found that useful today. What are your go-to exercises for patellofemoral pain? Have you any ones that you find really helpful that we've not considered here? If so, let us know in the replies and comments. If you haven't checked out any of our running injury videos, do have a look at those. We've got ones on tendon pain, lower back pain in athletes, iliotibial band syndrome. We've got something for everyone there. So do check out that link, access those free videos, and I'm sure they'll really help you in clinic. Okay, thanks again everyone for listening. I'll look forward to speaking to you again very soon. Bye for now.